Thank you everyone for joining us for our Red Hill Town Hall. Just as some background, my name is Garrison. I'm the Oʻahu chapter coordinator for Surfrider Foundation. And as many of you know, our focus is on protecting our ocean beaches and waves. So we are particularly focused on the areas of our coastlines and the ocean. And while Red Hill isn't directly and consistently impacting that area, we did feel like this was an all hands on deck moment, and we felt that there was a need from the community to really understand what was going on. I know I personally had 150 questions of the history and where we're at and what the updates are, and I know things are changing on a daily basis. And so this is just an opportunity for some of the activists and leaders who have been working on this for several years to share with you all what has been going on with Red Hill, the background, and then kind of where we're at and what the calls to action might be. So whether you're here from Surfrider, Sustainable Coastlines, or from another organization, we're glad you're joining us. Keep your questions in the chat, and we're gonna have about the first half of our event be a presentation by Sierra Club and Hawaiʻi Peace and Justice, and then the second half will be available for Q&A and discussion. So stick your questions in or hold them until the end, up to you, and we'll try our best to get to them. So, you know, just to share some context about what we've been talking about on the Surfrider side is how we support and making sure we understand really like all of the complexities of this issue, because it truly is so complex, and the jurisdiction and who's in charge and how we make the changes and what the alternative solutions are to storing all of this fuel. And so that's kind of what we're hoping to get out of it from the Surfrider side. And I wanted to give the platform over to Raphael Bergstrom, who was actually my predecessor in this position for several years and is now the executive director of Sustainable Coastlines Hawaiʻi and an inspiring leader in our environmental movement, just to share some words about why we are co-hosting this event.
Hello, Dere. Yeah, and aloha, everybody. As Dere said, my name is Raphael. I'm the executive director for Sustainable Coastlines Hawaiʻi. And I think similarly, some people might ask, okay, you guys work on beach cleanups and plastic, but I think echoing what Dere said, this about why we would be involved in this, and it affects all of our communities. And our mission is to inspire communities to care for their coastlines. And this is obviously a community issue, and it affects us. And ultimately, when we're talking about plastic pollution in our organization, our true messages are way beyond plastic pollution. It's that everything is connected from Mauka to Makai, and that if we do not understand that, we're not going to solve any of these issues. We like to use plastics as a gateway to understanding that there are personal choices that we can make that become the solutions to so many of these problems. I also just want to highlight too, when I was with Surfrider and even with Sustainable Coastlines, spending a lot of time working on policy and civic engagement in general. And I know Sierra Club's going to talk a lot about this in this case, and why this is also an issue to us, because similarly, the forces that we need to rise up to combat in our civic lives are very similar in their power structures in plastic pollution. So what I'm getting at is the fossil fuel industry, the plastics industry, the chemical industry have very strong lobbies backed by billions, if not trillions of dollars. And similarly, our military encroachment on places is backed by a very strong lobby with trillions of dollars at their disposal to really go against sometimes what the people want. And this is not to say that everybody in the military is at fault for this. It's the institution of it. Just similarly, like the fossil fuel industry is institutionally at fault for it, but everybody who works for fossil fuel industries is not necessarily at fault. So I want to make that distinction too. My last thing that I'll say before turning it over, I just wanted to share a passage and let this resonate a little bit with people. I found this book my fiance gave me, The Properties of Perpetual Light, and forgive me if I say his name wrong, but Julian Aguan from Guam. And I want to just read this passage because I just picked this up yesterday and I thought that it really resonated. So it says, in Guam, even the dead are dying. As I write this, the US Department of Defense is ramping up the militarization of my homeland, part of its $8 billion scheme to relocate roughly 5,000 Marines from Okinawa to Guam. In fact, ground has already been broken along the island's beautiful northern coastline for a massive firing range complex. The complex, consisting of 5 live firing training ranges and support facilities, is being built dangerously close to the island's primary source of drinking water, the Northern Guam Lens Aquifer. Moreover, the complex is situated over several historical and culturally significant sites, including the remnants of ancient villages, several thousands of years old, where our ancestor remains remain. And it goes on in this, and I think it's pretty obvious why I shared that, but just
smell this?
thinking of this as we go forward and ultimately the institutions that we are trying to help change to make a better world. So yeah, thank you for having me. And I'm really looking forward to listening to Sierra Club too.
Thank you, Raphael. I also wanted to make sure everyone's muted and to introduce yourself in the chat, just your name and what neighborhood you live in, so we can all kind of place ourselves where we are at on the island or otherwise. And would love to pass it over now. We have 4 speakers: Wayne Tanaka, Executive Director of Sierra Club of Hawaiʻi, Anna Chua, also with Sierra Club of Hawaiʻi. We have Kyle Kajihiro and Rebekah Garrison, who are with Hawaiʻi Peace and Justice, and they're going to be co-presenting for the next 45 minutes or so, and then we're going to go into a Q&A. So I'll pass it over to you all.
Thanks, Ture. Thanks, Raphael. It's a very beautiful introduction. We can start by, if it's okay, the 4 of us are just going to do quick introductions, share a bit about ourselves, and I can start us off. So my name is Anna. I am the Red Hill organizer for the Sierra Club. I live in Lower Manoa / Mo'iliili on Oʻahu. I just graduated from UH, and I studied, social sciences and environmental justice. And but I was actually born and raised in Malaysia. That's where I call home. And I have so many ties to this issue, even though I'm not from here. I do feel huge responsibility to protect our clean water. And as someone who is a settler, and I think it's a huge privilege to have clean water as well. I didn't have that growing up. It's just not healthy to be drinking water out of the faucet. And so when I came here and I could just put my cup under the faucet, it was a huge deal. And so I'm terrified of losing that. And we've already seen that across the island in Pearl Harbor and other areas. So yeah, I'll pass it on to Wayne.
Hi, everyone. Wayne Tanaka. I am the Executive Director of the Sierra Club of Hawaiʻi, born and raised on Oʻahu, in Mauna Loa, where I currently live, and then also in He'ea. Yeah, I think that's, I grew up fishing, exploring streams, going beach. So, I think that really informs my connection to this place. And why it was so important for me to come back here after living on the continent, or going to school on the continent. And a big part, I think, too, of that decision was where I went to college in Claremont. It's very dry. There's no water. There's no beaches, there's no ponds or natural water features, and that was the biggest thing I missed when I would go away. So yeah, so it's a blessing that we have, what we have here in Hawaii. I will pass this on to Rebekah.
Thank you, Wayne, and thank you, Anna. Thank you, Dore, for the beautiful introduction. My name is Rebekah Garrison. I was born and raised in Humboldt County in Northern California. I moved to Hawaii as a as a student, for undergrad student, a transfer student to University of Hawaii Manoa, and that's where I first began to learn about the horrific history of militarization in Hawaii and throughout the Pacific. So as a white settler in Hawaii and also in California, I do agree with Anna that we all have different types of responsibilities in Kuleana, especially calling Hawaii home. One thing we can all do is work towards the protection of our clean water and stand in solidarity with our Kanaka Maoli, the Kanaka Maoli community. I recently graduated from the University of Southern California with a PhD in American Studies, and I'm excited to be a community organizer now with Hawaii Peace and Justice. And I will now pass it over to Dr. Kyle Kajihiro.
Hey, aloha. Thanks everyone for the invitation to speak. My name is Kyle Kajihiro. I grew up and I currently live in Mo'iliili on the island of Oʻahu. When I was growing up, we used to play in the streams. I remember when that stream near the Willows restaurant was actually somewhat clean. And Manoa Stream was also, you know, it's a beautiful place. And I also grew up surfing and fishing, mostly around the South Shore, but all over the island. So water is a precious resource. And, you know, this is something that it takes it's sad that it takes a tragedy like what we're facing right now to make that realization real for many of us. So I want to thank you all for having this conversation with us and for showing your concern. And I do think that this is something that we have to win and we will win. And the other thing is I teach at the University of Hawaii in geography and ethnic studies. I got my PhD in geography a couple years ago. Thank you.
Thanks guys. Okay, I'm sharing my screen real quick. Can everyone see the first slide? Yes, awesome, thank you. Okay, so yeah, I'll start us off. So to give a quick rundown, we're gonna go through some background of Red Hill and then transition into, you know, the leaks and the history and some legal stuff, you know, what our concerns are with Red Hill and the facility and the structure. And then of course, we're gonna talk about the organizing, the advocacy, and what we can all do to win this fight. So to start off, I will give some background on Kapukaki, which is the Hawaiian name for Red Hill, which is more widely known. And this is a ridge in the Mauna Lua Ahupua'a, and it's located between Halawa and Mauna Lua. And so if you see this point here, that's where it is. And the aquifer beneath Kapukaki provides drinking water for approximately 400,000 residents from Halawa to Hawaii Kai. And so this doesn't include, you know, the folks who funnel in and out every single day. And so if you live in the area here shown in the pink, you receive your drinking water from the threatened aquifer. And so, you know, it includes everyone from downtown to Waikiki, all the way to Mauna Lua. And so the problem is this, 80 years ago, around the time of World War II, the US Navy constructed 20 underground storage fuel tanks. Again, 100 feet above our primary sole source aquifer on Oʻahu. 14 are in active use at all times, two of the 20 have been permanently decommissioned because they're in such bad condition. What's one thing to know is that the Navy has actually suspended operations at Red Hill, but the fuel is still in there because of what's happening right now. So each tank can hold up to 12.5 million gallons of jet fuel or marine diesel. So that means that the facility has the capacity to store 225 million gallons of fuel in total underground. And when these were first built, they were built like really hastily during World War II. And they are single lined tank walls. And when they were built, they were only a 1/4 inch thick. And so due to the way they were built and due to time, the tanks have corroded to some of them less than 1/3 of an inch of that in some places. And so Wayne gives a really good analogy when he talks about this is if you shrink the tanks down to the size of a hydro flask, these tank walls are about the thinness of a aluminum foil. And so, as you can imagine, no container of that size should be storing jet fuel right above our drinking water aquifer. I hope I got that analogy right, Wayne. But it's a great way to just kind of think about it relative to our daily lives. And so at this point, I'll pass it over to Rebekah to share a little bit about the leaky history of the tanks.
Thank you, Anna. A leaky history. So it is very difficult to keep up with all of the Navy's lies and cover-ups, especially as of late, but we'll do our best to break down the tank's leaky history for all of you today. There have been over 30 documented leaks that we know of, releasing at least 180,000 gallons of fuel since construction, most of which have never been located or cleaned up. We estimate that the amount of fuel released, and the military defines a release as either a leak or human error. So you might hear that word floating around in the media. But a release, we estimate that release to be much higher because in declassified documents, the Navy has many releases listed as an unknown quantity. So 180,000 gallons of released jet fuel is actually, if you can imagine, a conservative estimate. The largest leak to date, again, that we know of, happened in January 2014, in which 27,000 gallons of fuel was released from a single tank. That was tank 5. And more recently, there was a release of more than 1,600 gallons of fuel in May 2021. Kyle, is there anything you'd like to add before moving to slide 5? I was thinking maybe a quick history of Kapukaki or Red Hill as a classified site, maybe, if you wanted to add that in.
Just that, because these tanks were considered so strategic, they were classified until 1995. So even if they were leaking, even if there were problems, we would not have known about it. And the Navy has basically kept that covered up. And they continue to act with a kind of degree of secrecy over all their operations, including that some whistleblowers revealed that the Navy withheld information from a legal proceeding, right? Basically, they lied in a court proceeding that there was an active leak and they never told the hearings officer. So this is why people are just, they can't trust the Navy, but I'll turn it over and stop editorializing.
Thank you, Kyle, appreciate it. All right, so the next slide, slide 5, a more leaky history. So, what has been happening as of late? So getting back to the military's pattern of negligence behavior at Kapukaki or Red Hill, we know that in March of 2020, pipelines running from Red Hill started leaking, but it wasn't until almost a full year later, in January 2021, that the Navy confirmed it was an active leak. And they didn't find out about the the public didn't find out about the active leak until October 2021. So over a year and a half had passed before the public was even made aware that this leak was happening. And we still don't know, 1, how much fuel has leaked, 2, how long the leak lasted, and 3, what enforcement measures have been imposed, if any. Kyle, is there anything else you wanted to add to that slide before we hand it back over to Anna and Wayne?
No, go ahead.
All right, Anna, go ahead.
Thanks, guys. So that kind of leads us to what's happening right now. This catastrophe is unfolding every single day. I'm sure you guys are seeing the news. It's pretty nuts, but we can try to break it down in terms of a timeline, right? So about a month ago, on November 20th, 14,000 gallons of fuel and water mixture leaked from a fire suppression drain line at the Red Hill facility. And 3 days later, residents in Foster Village and the Aliamanu Military Reserve called 911 to report smelling fuel just, in their neighborhood. And then on November 28, residents living on military base reported smelling fuel in their water, but at the time, the Navy continued to deny that there was fuel in the water. And then a day later, residents reported health issues. As you guys have seen, all these jarring news reports about having chemical burns on their skin, in their mouth. Someone's dog passed away, kids are getting sick, adults are getting sick. And so at that point, the health department actually told Navy water users to avoid tap water for anything. So at all costs, like they were pretty much telling them to close their faucets and like wrap it in plastic, and not use their toilets because the fumes were also dangerous. And unfortunately, at the time, the Navy was still saying that the water is safe. And so we find out later on that the Navy had actually shut down the Red Hill shaft on November 28th. We only found out a couple days later. And something to know is that despite the fact that they shut down the shaft on November 28th, on November 29th, on the 29th and 30th, they were still saying that the water is safe to drink. And so, they were still at that point gaslighting their own residents. And then on December 1st, they released test results that said that the petroleum was detected in water samples from Red Hill Elementary School. And then a couple of days later, the Board of Water Supply shuts down Halawa shaft indefinitely. And to recap, the Halawa shaft sources water to 20% of urban Honolulu. So to many, many of us here in this meeting. And so it was, many of you guys probably saw the Board of Water Supply Chief Engineer Ernie Lau getting emotional TV. It was extremely heartbreaking, but that's because this is something that they've been sounding the alarm about for years and years. Shutting down the Halawa shaft has dire consequences as well for the rest of the island, because shutting down the shaft meant that they had to pump water to folks in the region that's impacted from other wells, which compromises the water supply of other communities on the island. And also, it is impossible to kind of predict when the Halawa shaft would be safe enough to open up again, because it pumps from the exact same aquifer that the Navy's Red Hill shaft pumps from. And so, opening it back up and pumping millions of gallons of water every single day could very much risk pumping fuel into the water supply of everyone in urban Honolulu. And on December 10th, samples from the Navy's Red Hill shaft contained diesel fuel 350 times above safe drinking water levels dictated by the DOH. And so as of right now, the latest update was actually on Wednesday, I believe. Board of Water Supply stated that the Red Hill shaft still contains fuel, high amounts of fuel, despite the fact that they're trying to skim the fuel basically out of the aquifer in the through the Red Hill shaft. And so to give everyone a history, well, it's not really history, it's 2014, but this will provide some context as to why a lot of bureaucratic things are happening right now in response to the catastrophe is not actually helping the cause. And so following the 2014 massive leak that Becca mentioned, the administrative order on consent was established to study, monitor, and consider improvements to the Red Hill facility. And so this involved the US Navy, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Hawaii Department of Health, as well as the Defense Logistics Agency. That these folks actually, they're engineers, and they kind of dictate where the fuel goes and how it gets transported to ships and whatnot. And so this is an order that regulators, aka EPA and EDOH, can force the Navy to do certain things and do certain studies. And we'll explain why this kind of failed. So 3 main sections in the AOC are corrosion, risk assessment, and tank upgrades. There were other things as well in this study, but we won't go into too much detail. And so first up is corrosion. So as I mentioned, the steel liners were 1/4 of an inch thick upon construction. And in March 2020, the EPA and DOH rejected the Navy's 2019 corrosion report because it had a 40% error rate, meaning that even their own studies couldn't be relied on. And so, as you folks can see here, some of the steel samples were as thin as 0.079 inches. That is about the thinness of a plastic ruler. And then when we talk about risk and vulnerability, in 2018, the Navy also did a study on, how probable it is that the tanks will leak. And they actually found that the tanks have a 27.6% chance of leaking up to 30,000 gallons annually. And this is, without the consideration of earthquakes, fires, and whatnot. And so as the years go by, that risk increases. In 5 years, that risk is 80%. In 10 years, that risk is 96%. And then the Navy also studied tank upgrade alternatives. In 2019, they released their preferred plan on how to upgrade these tanks. And unsurprisingly, the preferred choice is the least protective and least expensive option. And so the plan also commits to an undefined and undetermined double wall equivalency solution, or to relocate the tanks around 2045. And so the reason why we say undefined and undetermined is because this technology that they're alluding to doesn't actually exist, which is why they keep pushing back the deadline, 2037, 2038, 2045. And in all of their updates thus far, they've just been saying that it's still being studied, and this solution is going to be the holy grail. But regulators actually rejected that. To give folks a visualization, so these were the 6 options that they came up with, and they chose 1A, which is basically to keep the tanks how they are and recoat the lower dome with epoxy. And so again, all these studies have basically done nothing to, one, upgrade the facility or prevent the tanks from leaking. The Navy also did groundwater flow modeling, and it's extremely inaccurate. And all this to say is that, when we see things pop up right now, whether it's, Congress calling for independent investigations, or the state legislature, coming up with different studies to look into Red Hill, all of those things are to essentially slow down the process and to silence us, because we know from this AOC, which is supposed to be regulated by top health agencies in the state and federal level, have done nothing to protect us and our aquifer. And so to give folks a litigation history, on the Sierra Club side, in 2017, the Sierra Club sued DOH because DOH actually exempted Red Hill specifically from underground storage tank regulations. And so we won that lawsuit, but we had to sue them again in 2019 because DOH was basically allowing automatic permit approvals. And so that meant that the Navy could submit a permit application, and if there wouldn't be any rigorous studies to determine whether or not it was safe, and they would automatically approve their permit. And so Sierra Club won again, and so the DOH had to amend their rules. And because the Navy's permit application was not automatically approved, the tanks were operating without a permit. And so the Navy did apply for a permit eventually, and it was full of holes. And so the Sierra Club and the Board of Water Supply contested the Navy's permit to operate Red Hill. And so finally this year, Navy witnesses were cross-examined at the contested case. And this is where, Kyle was saying whistleblowers basically exposed Navy officials for lying during legal proceedings. And this is what they were referring to. And then in July, the Hawaii Department of Health Environmental Health Administration shifted their position on Red Hill and essentially concluded that the Navy hasn't proven that it can safely operate its underground Red Hill fuel tanks. And this was huge because prior to this, the DOH had been citing the Navy and saying that Red Hill was safe. And then in September, the hearing officer issued a recommended decision to drain nearly 40% of the tanks within 3 years. And so this was the closest to shutdown that we've ever gotten. Unfortunately, a month later, the whistleblower came out and exposed all these things about the leak at Pu'uloa last year, among other things the Navy officials had been covering up. And so DOH filed a motion to reopen the case, and that kind of leads us to where we're right now. It is in a limbo. It hasn't, next hearings haven't been rescheduled because of everything that's happening. But yeah, that's kind of some background on the legal stuff in case it is helpful to give context. And I'll pass it on to me.
It's my turn. Thanks. Okay, so you know, a big challenge, I think, up to this point in getting our decision makers and leaders to do what it takes to protect us and keep us safe is just how complicated, like all of the technical reports and documentation and the procedures they say they're going to follow and these plans that get rejected by regulators, like but it's very, there's a lot of dense technical information that the Navy points to, and there's a lot of uncertainty that lay folks have with regards to, you know, what it says in there, what it really, and whether it's really something that is going to keep, you know, us safe and the drinking water safe, and so that results in a lot of deference to the Navy's assurances. Uncertainty is just, it's like that. Like when we're not sure, oh, is the climate change going to happen? Then maybe not. So maybe we'll just keep doing the same thing and not changing course, right? So people, it's the status quo of these tanks has been benefited by this. But so what we've done is kind of go through all of the information that's been developed through the ALC, through our court cases, to kind of really simplify and make very clear why the Navy's can't be trusted to keep us safe. And so I'll just run down, you know, some major points. First, the Navy has no idea how bad the corrosion is. That steel liner that, as Anna said, if you shrank the tank down to a hydro flask, the steel liner, which is the only thing that keeps the fuel in these tanks, would have been the thickness of tin foil, like not heavy duty tin foil, just regular tin foil when they were brand new. It turns out that it's corroded now well past what the Navy thought it would be at. And that's in large part because when they built these tanks, their walls are so thin, they surrounded them with concrete. And between the steel liner and the concrete is a gap. And in that gap is water. So you basically have these tanks like just soaking in moisture, and moisture and metal causes corrosion. And that's why these tanks are actively corroded. I'm also worried about the rebar in the concrete because concrete is inherently porous. If there's moisture between the tank and the concrete, there's moisture in the concrete, which means there's moisture around the rebar, and that could also be the integrity of that could be undermined over 80 years, right? 8 decades. So, and the other thing with this concrete is you can't see the outside of the tank where the corrosion is taking place. You have to rip the concrete off, and that would basically, you know, destroy the tank. So, what they do is, there's no picture here, but they have a guy hanging, they drain a tank, and they have a guy hang from the top of the tank with a little scanner, and he scans this humongous tank, like inch by inch, to try and figure out where the weak spots are, you know, where it's corroded to the point that it needs repairs, you know, per their standards. This isn't a very reliable system. Like as Anna said, their corrosion report was rejected because it turns out when they did actually take one of these tanks that was inspected as part of their AOC, they took coupons, so they broke pieces of the tank off, they took the concrete off, and they actually directly measured the thickness of it. And it turns out their inspection system, which is one of the main things that they say is going to keep us safe, it misses the mark 40% of the time. And that's for the tanks that were inspected. 8 of the tanks that right now have like millions and millions of gallons of fuel in them, they haven't been inspected in over 20 years. 3 of those tanks haven't been inspected in over 38 years. I think one of those hasn't been inspected in like 50 something years. It's never undergone what's called an API 653 inspection. Industry standard is 10 years. And again, these are tanks that, so we don't know, the tanks are inspected, we don't actually know if they've been properly inspected. They were able to catch all the weak spots. And half of the tanks that fuel in them right now, over half, have been inspected well past, you know, the point where the industry would otherwise require them to have been looked at. And that's not okay. And then the other thing is, okay, sorry, there's a couple other points. In case you hear this, they say we do tank tightness testing every 6 months. That means they put a little pressure in the tank and then they see if the pressure changes to tell if there's a leak or not. That's not perfect. These tanks are so huge that they could lose something like 1,600 gallons of fuel in between inspection cycles, like tank tightness testing, and they wouldn't even know. They have a fuel level monitoring system that sounds an alarm if the fuel level changes a ½ inch, which sounds great, right? Oh, a ½ inch of fuel. That's actually, these tanks are so big, a ½ inch is like 2,400 gallons. So there could be like fuel leaking from these tanks actively, and we have no idea, and they have no idea. And maybe that's why there's, this mysterious fuel appeared in the drain line that leaks 14,000 gallons of fuel water mixture and has now potentially sickened hundreds of people. And that's their system of systems, right? That's the things that, this is a structures they put in place to keep us safe. Their system of systems is also falls short of addressing some major risk factors. So earthquakes, when these tanks were brand new, there was an earthquake in 1948, 1,100 barrels of fuel spilled. That's 46,000 gallons. I don't think that's included in that 180,000 gallon figure. It's in this Bechtel report from way back when that we dug up in our lawsuit. That was when these tanks were brand new. These tanks are 80 years old, they're actively corroding, they're brittle, the concrete is, I don't know what's going on with the concrete. Another earthquake, and we can't prevent that. We can't prevent an earthquake from happening. Like the Navy just says, oh, it's unlikely there'll be an earthquake. Well, we had one and we will have one. You can't prevent human error, right? So, these last major spills, including what they're saying is poisoning people, those are due to human error. And you just can't, as an engineer, you can't avoid that, and there's real consequences to human error that we fortunately haven't seen. Just this year with that, there's an explosion essentially because they pulled the valves in the wrong direction, in the wrong order. Pipes blew off of their couplings. One pipe swung 16 inches, hit some metal infrastructure, like some ducting, and like deformed the ducting. If metal hits concrete, like you can go outside and get like a hammer or something, hit the concrete, you'll see sparks fly. And if there's a fuel leak that we don't know about, there's a fuel in the environment that we don't know about, then that could be not good either, right? You can't avoid human malice, you can't avoid Murphy's Law. So all kinds of, electrical fire because of flooding, because of drain line breaks and there's flood in the outlet, and then you have electrical fire combined with a fuel that you don't know about in the environment. Like there's all kinds of, I can think of all different scenarios where, the stars will align and then life as we know it will be very different. Next slide. And so what happens if there is a spill, right? Like a big spill. We now know when in May of this year, they spilled 1,600 gallons. They said, oh, we got it all, don't worry, our system works. And then next thing we know, there's soil vapor readings showing that there's fuel in the environment that escaped. They couldn't contain that. Now they're saying maybe this is where the current poisoning is coming from. In 2014, that 27,000 gallon spill, a little bigger of a spill, it definitely, penetrated 30 feet. We have oil sheens in the groundwater that indicate that it also hit the groundwater. Each tank holds up to 12.5 million gallons. So there's 1 million gallons spilling from a rupture or a hole that's lower in a tank and they can't drain it fast enough. Like 1 million gallons is 37 times what we saw in 2014. It will definitely, we don't know where it will flow. Like there's all these different, they don't know how fuel flows under the tanks, but we do know, it will hit the groundwater at some point. And once fuel's in there, it's like, we're not gonna be able to get it out. They could try to, if they knew where the fuel went, they could bore a hole and then try and suck out as much fuel as they can, but like, we don't know where the fuel's gonna go. And once it's in the actual groundwater, that's like, it's practically impossible to fix that situation, especially in a large catastrophic spill. And so what does that mean if the unthinkable happens, right? It's obviously huge environmental and agricultural impairment. The streams and springs, estuaries that are fed by this aquifer are gonna, petroleum is actually super toxic to aquatic life, to plants, to the microorganisms in the soil that help, plants uptake nutrients at much lower concentrations than it is for humans. It basically creates this film that smothers like those kinds of little things that keep the world running. Even right now, we're looking at a potential water moratoriums during the summer. If we lose the drinking water, 50% of the drinking water supply for from Halava to Mauna Lua, we can't replace that. So we're just gonna have to use less water. Or we import bottled water, or we desal and create a whole lot of sludge, saline sludge. I don't know where we were gonna put that. We're not, we won't have water for housing if you care about housing. We can't even build ADUs right now because of water issues, water supply issues. So if we lose this water, we're not going to be able to address our housing crisis. Our tourism industry, I don't know how that's, I don't know how it's going to work this summer if we have a water moratorium or conservation mandates. It's going to increase the cost of, at minimally, the hotels have to pay way more to provide water for their guests, which means the industry in its peak summer months is going to be, dragged down already. That's what we're looking at. Just the cost of living in Hawaii, that's already high. It's going to increase like that much more if we can find a way to, to supply water to the folks that will no longer be able to get water from the aquifer. And for me, the biggest thing is, this aquifer has always provided for life on this island, whether it's the abundant fisheries of Pu'uloa, the dozens of loku'i'a, the lo'ikalo, the royal lands of Wanalua, Kamananui, Kamanaiki, that supported the thriving, Native Hawaiian population to the present day, where now this is the aquifer that helped us build our homes, our hospitals, our schools, our communities, up until, and support them up until right now. This aquifer that supported every generation on this island up to now, under our watch, we will be the ones in this generation to witness it potentially become lost forever. And I feel like that's a failure of the generations before us. That's our failure of the generations after us. And for me, that keeps me up at night. Okay, is this me, or is this on me?
I'll take it from
All right, okay, give us hope.
Thank you so much, Wayne. I'll continue here. So advocacy, what can we do? As a non-Kanaka, haole, settler, transplant, however you identify, we all have kuleana, a responsibility to Hawaii, because we all call Hawaii home. If you move to Hawaii from the continent, it is likely you learned little to nothing about the illegal annexation of Hawaii to the US and the militarized and colonial violence Kanaka Oʻahu have endured since haole contact. We urge you to read up on this history and its colonial continuities into the contemporary moment. And we recommend Haunani K. Trask's book, From a Native Daughter, Noe Silva's book, Aloha Betrayed, and Noe Goodyear Ka'opua's book, The Seeds We Planted. It might be that you're not ready for a die-in at the state capitol or for sign waving in front of a military installation, and that's okay. We want to meet you where you're at because we all have talents to share, and there's no talent too small for demilitarization work. And in this case, the protection of clean, unpolluted water. We're hoping that one way Surfriders and Sustainable Coastlines can help contribute is by having folks continue to write and give oral testimonies in support of Bill 48 and Resolution 21-276. I know some folks already did this, and we thank you for your contributions. It was really beautiful to hear some of your voices come out just a few days ago. Thank you so much for that. And please keep sending in letters and urging the Honolulu City Council to permanently remove the tanks from Kapukaki. So Bill 48 requires any operator of underground storage tanks with the capacity of 100,000 gallons or more to obtain a permit from the city. It further stipulates that no permit will be granted unless the applicant proves that the tank or tank system will not leak regulated substances into the environment. So this is a huge bill. And also looking at Resolution 21276 urges the permanent removal and relocation of the US Navy Red Hill Bulk Fuel Storage Facility and their underground storage tanks. Kyle, is there anything you want to add before moving to the next slide?
Oh, go ahead.
All right, thanks. All right, so the next slide, why a city ordinance matters. So we believe it will take a multi-pronged approach and the strength of the island's various communities to shut down Red Hill and protect Kapukaki. The city has a public trust duty to protect the purity of Oʻahu's groundwater. Federal law authorizes local governments to enact groundwater storage tank requirements that the federal government must follow. State law allows the counties to enact ordinances as long as they are not inconsistent with the state rules. So this is really important because we can see how local governing structures can mandate and require certain laws that the federal government and various entities must follow. So over 1,000 written testimonies were submitted, and the Honolulu City Council voted unanimously to pass those measures. We're very thankful to those folks. And so we really want to try and get another 1,000. So we're encouraging folks to keep writing letters. And Kyle, anything else you wanted to add in terms of multi-pronged approach or city ordinances?
Well, I'll just add that, why this particular ordinance is important. We've been failed by the federal government and state government in actually dealing with this problem for many years. They've just made excuses, kicked the can down the road. And now we have a genuine catastrophe unfolding in real time, right? So I think that this ordinance is about local communities taking back some of its power to actually govern the things that matter to us, right? The federal law, as Rebekah said, delegates some of that authority to the local community. So we should demand that our city council exercise that authority and protect our water.
Thank you, Kyle. And so the next slide, actually, Kyle will be taking the lead on thinking about organizing and solidarity. Go ahead, Kyle.
Okay, thanks. So one of the Hawaiian chants that you may have heard and seen in some of the videos and rallies recently it talks about the waters, the Waiā Kane, right? The waters of Kane. And it asks, where are the waters of Kane? So that's sort of the refrain. And then it goes through and names all the different forms of water, right? From in the sea to the mountaintops, to the waterfalls, the streams, the clouds, the rainbows, the storms, the water that percolates up and as bursts from the ground. These are all the forms of the waters of Kane. And I just, it's a beautiful poetry, but it's also a reminder that water connects everything, right? The water cycle connects everything. And in Hawaiian legend, the Mo'olelo talks about Kane, the deity that governs fresh water, and Kanaloa, the deity of the sea, as twins. And they travel the islands together to create springs that will feed us, fresh water, right? So the link, the bond between fresh water and the sea is integral, and they both rely on each other, right? And I think as ocean protectors, land protectors, Kia'i Aloha Aina, we know that these systems are interdependent, and we have to protect the whole thing. Otherwise, something that interferes with one begins to break down the whole system. Part of my work that I was doing before going back to graduate school was as a organizer and a program director for the American Friends Service Committee, and continuing with the Hawaii Peace and Justice as a volunteer. One of our concerns is the U.S. military's impact on the environment, on communities, on societies. Not only the wars that are happening in other places. As a peace group, we advocate for peace and nonviolent solutions, but also the violence that happens with the military occupation of land, the activities that pollute and destroy and desecrate. And in the case of Hawaii, we have two kuleanas, right? The fact that Hawaii was occupied by the U.S. military, that the Queen was overthrown, a sovereign country was overthrown, was mainly for military purposes. And then from Hawaii, wars were practiced and then inflicted on other peoples in other lands around the world. So we have two kuleanas to address the violence that's happening here, as well as the consequences in these other lands, right? And so in that way, we also see the connections, right? We're not alone in this struggle. I guess that's the kind of the beautiful and tragic, the beauty in this tragedy is that the desecration of the wai, of the water, and the terrible pollution and contamination of people and them getting sick is revealing all of our vulnerability to this threat, right? That is, I think, a kind of a realization that to me gives me hope, because it gives me it makes me realize that we are in this fight together. We have to stand up to protect this precious resource that all life needs to survive. And so through my work doing addressing the military's environmental impacts, and there are many, I think the latest reports list something like 1,000 military contamination sites in Hawaii alone. Within the Pearl Harbor complex, I counted about 700 and something sites. So what was once a food basket for Oʻahu, an aina momona, the fat land that fed the people, is now a place that you can go along the shoreline and you'll see the signs that say, don't eat the fish, don't eat the crabs, right? They're all poison. In addition to that, the US military is like the largest polluter in the world in terms of its carbon emissions and other kinds of toxins. And we know this also that our allies, our brothers and sisters across the world, in Guam, in Okinawa, in the Philippines, in Korea, in Vieques, Puerto Rico, they're all dealing with these toxic legacies of US militarism, right? In the Philippines, for example, even though they were successful in pushing out US bases, the contamination at Clark Air Base got into the groundwater, and poor communities, houseless people that were living in those areas and using the water, they started to have these horrible birth defects because of those toxins. So I fear that this is, could be the disastrous future that we have in Hawaii if we don't stop this problem right now. And the hopeful thing is that we can and we have stopped these kinds of things before. We have won these campaigns. In Hawaii, Kaho'olawe was a great victory for the Hawaiian people, for all lovers of peace and the environment, right? Brave activists in 1976 began to organize, and they stopped the bombing of the island in 1990, got the land partially cleaned and returned as a cultural site. In Vieques, Puerto Rico, the people there risked hundreds of arrests and stopped the bombing of their island, right? And so we have these examples, these precedents to go on. The other issue I just want to mention that's linked to this is we have an opportunity in 2029 to get back about 30,000 acres of land that the military leases from the state of Hawaii for $1 for 65 years. I'll repeat that, $1 for 65 years. They've taken these Hawaiian trust lands. These are the stolen lands of the Hawaiian Kingdom, Crown and government lands, in Makua, in Kahuku, in Po'amoho near Wahiawa, and also at Pohakuloa on Hawaii Island. And in some cases using it for live fire training, which is very destructive of the environment. But the leases expire in 2029. And we think this is a great opportunity to start cleaning up those lands and having some land back for Hawaiians and for the people of Hawaii. So we hope you'll also pay attention and see these struggles as linked, right? Protecting our water, protecting the land, so that we actually have a future on these islands.
Thank you, Kyle. And then on this next slide, just real quick, other ways you can help protect the water, contact President Biden and the Secretary of Defense and tell them to retire the antiquated Red Hill facility. Organize your power to help pressure directly and indirectly our targets and kill this cancer and cancer-causing agents. We all have our own expertise, skills, and love for wai to contribute to this movement. Talk to your neighborhood boards, friends, aunties, and uncles, and tell them to join you in this fight. There really is no talent too little to work towards demilitarization and clean and healthy, unpolluted water. And I'll go ahead and pass it back to Anna. Thank you.
Thanks, Becca. Thanks, Kyle. So yeah, on that note, we wanted to share some places that you can stay updated on the current catastrophe, but also on action alerts, and things that we are working on to win this fight. As Becca mentioned, like it's very much a multi-pronged approach. We just have to hit them where it hurts, but also hit them from every single angle that we can. Federal, state, city, and also direct action, all of them are extremely, extremely important. So wherever you feel you can contribute and where your skills lie, all of those really, really matter. So yeah, here are just some resources, whether it's website, Border Water Supplies website also has really great resources on water conservation, and especially if you live in urban Honolulu, how you can help to ensure that we don't fall into a bigger catastrophe. And our Sierra Club Red Hill website also has live-ish updates on what's happening in case you get lost in all the news articles. And of course, Oʻahu Water Protectors is the community coalition that is growing, that plans most of the, or a lot of the direct action things, along with a lot of other coalitions and organizations on island. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Dure, Raphael, for having us. And, oh, sorry, Kai, we're gonna say something. Okay. Yeah, thank you guys so much.
Thanks, Anna. Let's end the screen share and we can kind of open it up to everybody. Okay, great. So I just wanted to go over some of these questions I'm seeing here first, and then we can continue that process. So Patty's asking if someone can speak to how going after the Navy for Red Hill and the history of the military's behavior in Hawaii as being anti-military or US. I've definitely heard that we don't want to be anti-military. So I'll let whoever wants to speak to that answer.
Well, I think it was addressed to me. So hi, Patty. I think again, it's not about the individuals, right? We see clearly that the military families are victims of this as well, right? And we see what happens when troops go to war and then they come home wounded emotionally, psychologically, physically, and are neglected. So in many ways, they're being used by this system, by this apparatus that really is we're seen as expendable to the mission, and I think that's been the history, the pattern for many years, where places like Kaho'olawe, places like Makua have been sacrificed. People have lost their land. People have been have died from accidents or been wounded, and so we're saying that there maybe is a different logic for actually having security, like having clean water, for example, and having an environment that sustains life is actually our form of security, right? Having these tanks is proven itself to be actually almost like a threat to our security. It is a threat. It has actually harmed people. So I think that's the purpose. And really when they talk about the threat from China and all of this, I think that's a kind of a red herring, because really the United States is sort of creating enemies in its policies which justify the continued buildup of its military infrastructures. So we have to always be mindful that there is a political economy to militarization, right? People are making money off of this stuff by creating enemies around the world and continue to fund it. So I think we would be better served by putting those resources into cleaning up our environment, dealing with climate change in a serious way, right? All of these things that we know the Earth needs to survive. So thanks.
Thanks, Kyle. Yeah, I think having an awareness about the negative impacts of the military-industrial complex does not mean you're anti-military. It's just knowing the impact and that it can be harmful. So I'm just seeing here a note about other underground fuel storage tanks. Can anyone speak to like where else these might exist in Hawaii?
Oh yeah, I do believe that the Pacific Missile Range facility in Kauai has 2 large underground storage fuel tanks. I'm not sure if I've heard of any others. rewrites of Pohaku law.
There are two decommissioned ones up in the one in Waikakalawa and the other one in Kipapa. So they have pipelines running all the way down to Hickam, but those have been decommissioned, and I don't know how much they've been cleaned up. I know they've leaked in the past. The one at PMRF is one. Someone told me yesterday that there are underground tanks at Mokapu, Kaneohe Marine Base. I've never seen them, but they said there are big tanks under there too. So.
Just on the note about decommissioning, I feel like it's important to emphasize, I think I learned from one of you that in Washington and California, that decommissioning underground tanks had occurred. Can someone just speak really briefly to, how it's happened in other places so we can kind of wrap our head around how we can do it here?
I can take a stab and then you guys can add in, but yes, so Point Loma, that's in, I believe, San Diego, California, Kitsap in Washington. So it's pretty much almost exactly the same situations. The Navy built underground storage tanks during World War II to store fuel. And I believe it's the one in Washington that had leaked. I'm going to share a Civil Beat article right after I'm done speaking about this investigation, but it was much of a smoother experience for the communities there to get the fuel relocated to above ground storage tanks into like state-of-the-art facility. And I don't believe the EPA was involved in either of the situations. I think it was just the county in negotiations with the Navy. And I will note that in one of the, I think it was in Kitsap, the fuel leak that happened is still impacting the environment there. Yeah, Becca, go.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna add, so it's not like we're asking the military to reinvent the wheel. They've actually already created a precedent for this type of defueling, decommissioning, and then taking tanks from underground and putting them above ground. So there are examples of safe ways to do this. Thank you.
On that note, Wayne, you had mentioned that there's a location on island called Par Pacific that has stated that they do have the capacity to take the current fuel. Can you just touch on that briefly for everyone?
Yeah, there's so right now, so for the Sierra Club, we don't officially, I mean, our members have various perspectives of the military and whatnot. I mean, we're not saying get the military out of Hawaii necessarily, but we're saying get this fuel away from our water supply yesterday. And so we have identified ways to immediately, protect our drinking water source. There's a fuel storage facility in Kapolei called Par Pacific. They can hold maybe a third of what's in the tanks right now. There are other facilities and other bases, other private, fuel holders, distributors, where we could put some of the remaining fuel. We could get tankers. Tankers should be coming here right now. From wherever the US should be asking Japan. They should be asking other places if they don't have the capacity. But we need ships coming here right now to take whatever fuel is left.
And then people are asking about the cost. So is there kind of a well fleshed out understanding of how much that could cost or how long it would take to find a viable alternative to defuel?
So I think that 10 billion figure it's not to defuel, it's to rebuild some alternative facility that can also, serve the Navy's, needs. To defuel, I think would be significantly less. And it's not like in any case, you don't need that 10 billion right away. It's going to take them, a little while to plan out, whatever they want to do. So defueling is, it shouldn't be cost prohibitive. And this is the Navy. This is the military. This is the most powerful Navy military in the world that spends billions of dollars. Like it's like candy. So yeah, we're not expendable. The population of this island is not expendable. It's the national security of the Pacific is also at risk here too. So yeah, I don't think that cost is not convincing me that they can't do anything.
Right. Okay, Scott, I do see your hand. I'm gonna go through some of these questions that came in this chat and then come to you after. Someone is asking, I know all pipelines are all somewhat connected, but does the military have their own water line that goes straight into military housing? Because there's other areas that had tainted water. So can someone speak to that question? If they're separate from Board of Water Supply?
Yes, the Navy has its own water system, which is separate, although there are points where they can connect and share water. So I think that some of that might be happening where Board of Water Supply water is being pumped into the Navy system to feed certain parts of the Navy system. But because the Navy system is interconnected, when they started pumping from the contaminated well under Red Hill, it got into everywhere. And the analogy that I thought was really compelling, Erwin Kawada was testifying at the city council. He said, imagine putting salad dressing into a glass of water and trying to empty it out. And then you wipe it off and that oil film just stays and stays and stays. That's what's in the Navy system right now. So even as they're flushing it out, it's coated, it's dissolving into solution, it's getting spread around everywhere. And so the Board of Water doesn't want it getting into their system. And that's why they shut down their tanks out of precaution. They didn't, 2 straws drinking from the same cup. If they kept drinking and the other person stopped, they would have drawn the contamination toward their well. So that's why they shut down the Halava shaft. The Navy has shut down its Red Hill shaft and the Aiea Halava shaft, which is just kind of near the stadium. They have one more shaft that they're drawing water from in Waiʻava. So that's the only Navy well that's currently, I think, still pumping water, and then they're borrowing from Board of Water.
Thanks, Kyle. Okay, and Regina had a question. Instead of so much bottled water, can't they provide filters for each tap? So can someone talk about if you can actually filter out this type of contamination?
Not with the home installed filter. I think there's technology for that. For example, one of the like the Navy's talked about water treatment plants, and I think the Board of Water Supply, someone correct me if I'm wrong, talked about desalination, treatment, stuff like that. But I don't think you can ever install something at home that can filter out petroleum.
It's like you can't get into the aquifer and clean it out with Dawn. Once it's there, it's there. And the problem is, as Erwin Kawata and Ernie Lau have been talking about, is once it gets into the filtration system, then you're going to have to replace all of the piping as well, right? So once the contamination, the petroleum is in there, it's nearly impossible to take out. I don't know if Wayne and Kyle want to speak to that further. Thanks.
I'll just add that, I think there are some, technologies and ways of getting out fuel contaminants from water, but it's really expensive. It takes a long time. There are ways to use microbes that help to eat that stuff and break it down into less toxic substances. But again, it takes time, and we don't have time with this immediate emergency that we have and the threat of more contamination coming out. But in terms of cleaning up the aquifer in the long term, the problem with this is that it's so deep underground in the rock, right? They don't understand. All the geohydrologists have been trying to figure out, what does it look like? How does the rock formations move water, store water? And they haven't characterized it totally accurately yet. They don't know what it does. So this is why they can't find the fuel that leaked out and why it's popping up in places they never expected it. So that's the danger, is that you can't get to it, you can't see it, and then it might emerge somewhere else that harms you.
Thank you for that. Okay, Scott, you want to ask your question?
Aloha, thank you very much. This has really been informative. Couple of maybe sidebar questions. I've sat through all the testimony yesterday, and I guess I'm pretty well as versed as anyone on this now. I've been working on this issue for at least 10 years. I'm wondering, is this the venue that we might share some information about the lawsuits that are going on and the legal side of this? I know some of that's got to be carefully kept, but that's one question, and which leads me to my sidebar question. Is there's a local attorney, Michael Green, who's a very prominent local attorney, and I read or saw somewhere that he was having a meeting on Red Hill a few days ago. Does anyone know anything about that? Thank you very much. Are you there?
I think I saw Michael Green on the news talking about some of the current contamination, like the harms that have befallen the folks in the military's water system, and all the claims that are coming forward from that issue. I don't know if he's looking at the broader, the fact that there still remains like over 100 million gallons of fuel 100 feet above the model, I prefer.
So I don't know if Wayne folks can talk about the two legal cases you have going, but the other one, there's another case that was the plaintiff's group is called Wyola Alliance, and they are suing they're suing under RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which and they're seeking some sort of containment of any possible leaks and spills as more of a interim measure. So I don't know the status of that lawsuit, but that's a group that's actually, they're having a rally this afternoon down at the gate of the Navy. So there are several groups actually working on this issue right now, moving in parallel.
Yeah, So those guys filed a notice of intent to sue maybe a month and a half ago. And there's a 90-day notice period. So we'll see what happens with that. What they're asking for actually is not as strong as what is currently on the table with the governor's emergency order. The governor's emergency order that the Navy is challenging says you have 30 days essentially to check all your pipes, make sure they're not going to leak further if you defuel the facility, and then defuel the facility. It's pretty strong. It's pretty much what we need. The Navy is challenging that. We're not confident that the DOH will necessarily hold the line, and so we're seeking to intervene as the Board of Water Supply. If we are allowed as parties, then they can't compromise without us. And our position is, to me, the only sane and logical position, which is you have to defuel the facility as soon as safely possible. And then we have more, there's a contested case hearing that's going to reopen next year probably over the permit application that Anna was talking about.
Okay, awesome. We have a lot more questions. So I just want to give time to get through everyone. So I'm going to try my best to go in order. Nicole is asking why the state underground storage tank program, UST program, doesn't apply. Does anyone have an answer to that one?
So that's what we sued to force the DOH to apply its underground storage tank regulations to the Red Hill facility, as it's allowed to do under federal law. And we won. So the Navy submitted an application, a permit application, and then we contested that in 2019. We didn't get a hearing until February of this year, and that hearing has now been it's been extended. It's likely to be reopened because, as Rebekah mentioned, I think there's all these whistleblowers that said, hey, the Navy actually didn't, under oath, they didn't disclose all of the things that they were supposed to disclose.
Got it. Okay, just FYI, we're going for another 15 minutes, so we're gonna do our best. Anna answered the question about the next hearing for Bill 48. So it looks like it's Tuesday, January 11th. So you can add any additional details in the chat for that, for any of the organizers here, for everyone to stick in their calendars while they're here. Neil, do you have a question for us? You wanted to unmute?
I have a comment and a question, or just something I'd like to put on the table. I just wrote a comment that the Navy will ultimately say that it is exempt from federal law because of national security. I am originally from Washington, D.C. I'm a political wonk since I was a kid, and I'm 71 years old. So I'm just going to give you an old story. Back when the federal government wanted to, during the Reagan administration, wanted to do away with the National Endowment for the Arts. Gone. They just wanted to cut it. At the time, it was a $90 million, 87 million. It wasn't even a billion. And a choreographer, a famous dancer by the name of Elliot Feld, was asked to speak at the Congressional Committee hearing. And he drew this analogy that the entire national budget for the National Endowment for the Arts was 6 feet, represented 6 feet, the cost of 6 feet of one Trident nuclear submarine. And we have 70 some at the time. And at that point, the committee folded and they didn't cut the funds. So, you know, the Navy, where it's going to say it's exempt because of national security, and there, you could argue that there is a national security issue, but so I continually ask, well, what would be the cost? What does the Navy say it's going to cost to, one, cleaning the aquifer is a separate problem from changing the storage facility, because you're never going to win that they don't need to store fuel. So what's the cost? And if you translate that to a number of Abrams tanks, it becomes a fallacious argument. It's like, look, we have 3,000 Abrams tanks. If we only had 2,900, we could solve this problem. And I'm just going back to what Elliot Feld did. It was very effective. And as I said, that was the end of the hearing. They just said, okay, that's ridiculous. We're not cutting the National Endowment for the Arts. So I think we need to sort of make them look silly in our arguments. I mean, we can sit here all day and say, yeah, we need to clean up the aquifer. We all agree with that. I mean, and the Navy needs to do something else, and we all agree with that. But until we start to make them look silly, and I'm going back to Washington, D.C. silly, we're kind of, you know, we're not going to win. And they're going to stonewall just like they've been stonewalling. And we've got to actually get some involvement in Washington, D.C. And I hate to say that's going to take time, but all things in Washington take time. But I think we need to, you know, come up with a PR, a slightly different mechanism for getting the word out about how actually silly this is in terms of cost. Because in the end, it's a cost issue.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, so does anyone want to talk about moving this up to the DC level? Or if we've heard from Congress or the Biden administration about this?
Yeah, that's that's precisely right. And we can, you know, there's all different kinds of legal theories and approaches, but what we've seen, you know, even in our lawsuits, it gave us information that we need to educate folks. But ultimately, I think the solution is going to be a political one, and you have to look up the chain of command, right? So the local Navy command, I mean, they've failed in every way, in leadership, in competency, in basic human decency. We have no faith in them. So that's, you know, our strategy now is to direct, you know, our efforts at the Secretary of the Navy, who hasn't been great, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who was he was appointed by Obama to be the commander of the Central Command, which is the high, you know, one of his highest rank before he retired, and now Biden made him Secretary of Defense, and then the Commander in Chief, who is President Joe Biden. And so what folks can do, you know, in addition to writing directly to these folks, like no one writes to the Secretary of Defense, so he's freaking out because he's getting hundreds of letters right now of people like asking him not to destroy their home and their children's future. But think about who can influence these people. Is it, you know, national media outlets? Is it people they know? Other people that we might be able to reach, like former President Obama, like AOC, like Kamala Harris, like the folks from our island that are now serving in his administration, and how can we reach them? And folks like Oʻahu Water Protectors, who, you know, Hawaiʻi Peace and Justice and Sierra Club have been working with, are kind of trying to organize and making those actions that will hopefully be visible enough, and also network out to other indigenous groups, other folks who have struggled in their own communities, to build like a national coalition that can reach, you know, reach the Pentagon, reach the White House.
Mhm. Okay, great. Thank you, Wayne. Okay, so just moving through our questions in order. One is it Sierra Club opinion that, or does Sierra Club have an opinion if DOH is a friend or foe?
We're encouraged by, there's been changes in staff. It's really interesting to see how all of a sudden, you know, all of a sudden there's certain people that come into certain positions of DOH, and all of a sudden they're recognizing that this is they're actually treating the Navy like a gas station. Like they go and do surprise inspections on gas stations all the time. For the first time, they did one in October of last year, and instead of letting them slide, they actually held them accountable to the standards they hold everyone else, and they found like all kinds of crazy violations. So we're encouraged on the direction they're going. We're very encouraged by the emergency order that came out. But we're not going to say, you know, given that there are years of foot dragging and understanding of politics that, you know, thus far have, you know, favored the military over everyone else, we are, you know, we're keeping our eyes, we're closely watching them, I guess I'd say.
Great. Does Sierra Club think that the fuel should be drained and moved elsewhere off island out of Hawaii?
We think the fuel should be drained and put away from our water in this, you know, safe other locations for now. And that's, I mean, like we need to focus on that. Like get the fuel away from our water. It's their problem to figure out, you know, what they want to do with their whatever. But we just get the fuel away, get the fuel away from our water. Like.
Right. Okay, awesome. All right, so can somebody just speak really briefly to what an aquifer is, in case, just since there was some chat discussion about that, just to explain to people who aren't familiar how it works and why it's so difficult or impossible to clean.
So, okay. So I think there was a comment that said it's not like a big bowl, but it's more like a sponge, and that's, you know, that's exactly correct, right? It's all kinds of different characteristics of the substrate, and it's heterogeneous, which means it's not all the same. So you're gonna have, you know, like, you know, little lava tubes, little like rubble, kind of like clinker they call it, that's gonna hold a lot of water. You're gonna have harder stuff like pahoehoe, like and that's gonna, you know, it's gonna divert water. And again, that's why we don't know how stuff will flow. And sometimes, you know, water will not, you know, they'll go in very unpredictable ways, even upstream. And so the Navy has a model of where they think groundwater flows, but then when you look at, and it's a very complicated technical model, and they probably spent millions of dollars to build it, but then when you look at where you can measure groundwater, it doesn't match up. And so like the regulators are like, you know, your model doesn't, there's something wrong with it. And we just don't know. And that's why it's discouraging when, you know, now I think the congressional delegation is asking for another groundwater model, like analysis. Like we've gone through that, and it's just gonna waste more time and more money when the only logical next step is to get the fuel away from the water supply.
Could I share my screen real briefly just to show an illustration from Board of Water?
Sure.
Okay, thanks. So this is an illustration that Board of Water Supply uses. This shows, you know, the aquifer is the water that percolates down through the cracks and through the soil and accumulates on top of the salt water, and it creates a kind of a bubble of fresh water, and that's what is tapped by these various kinds of wells. So some of them are these dike tunnels, which is, for example, like the Waiahole ditch, which pulls water out of the mountain and takes it over to the cane fields. The Halava shaft, and I think the Red Hill shaft is this type of incline shaft. So it's taking water sort of off the top of the lens. And that's why if there's any contamination floating on top of it, it's going to get sucked into that system. That's why it's pretty bad. The deep wells go down below and they're pulling water up. But the danger with that is they could start sucking salt water up into the fresh water if they pump too much. And so this is why they've been afraid of pumping, of shifting the burden to other wells. I just want to share a couple other slides real fast, since people were asking. This is the map of the Board of Water Supply pipeline that's served by the Halava shaft there at the top left. And you can see that there's several other pumping stations along that system, but most of the water in the system comes out of the Halava shaft. And right now that one is down, right? They've turned it off. And here is a map that was in the Civil Beat, the only map I've seen of the Navy water system. So you can see the red dots here, Red Hill shaft, Halava shaft, and the Waiawa shaft are the three pumping stations for the Navy system. And two of those are down. Only the Waiawa shaft at the very top is still pumping. But you can see how it crisscrosses the whole Pearl Harbor area. And this is why people way out in Ewa Beach at Iroquois Point are having problems. And people in Manana, Pearl City Peninsula, Magoo Point, on Ford Island even, they're having problems with their water.
Thank you, Kyle. Okay, we're nearing the end. I'm going to pass it over to Raphael since he is helping us co-host in case he has any questions or final thoughts here.
I just had a question, and I'll just add really quick what Lynette has been saying in here about the aquifer issue. I think that what we can all do as groups, organizations, and anybody who's on this call is help share with the public what an aquifer is and how complicated that it actually is, and that it isn't just a bowl that we can go and clean. And I think that's just a really valid point, that oftentimes we think people might know things that we know, and that's just not always true. So the power of sharing our knowledge is really a big thing. And speaking of which, my question, Sierra Club, is I was listening on the legislative briefing that happened a few days ago where the panel of legislators grilled the Navy, and it was painful for me to watch, because I have stood by all of you in that building in the past, where many of these same people who were pushing the blame onto the Navy had disregarded a lot of your advice, and now we're trying to make themselves look good in how that they were coming after the Navy. And I have to be very careful, as we're a 501c3, not a 501c4 like you guys are. But I guess my question is, for those of us who not necessarily, or for the people who haven't been along for the ride the whole time, and when you guys do your discussions of candidates going forward, will you be highlighting this issue, and very specifically the lack of voice that came up from some of them that then very quickly shifted when they were on the spot with a catastrophe?
I'm not sure if we've thought through, the strategic value of calling folks out about things. I think, it definitely needs to be a campaign issue if it's not resolved, by the time that season rolls around. We're encouraging, everyone that's planning a campaign debate, that's doing a candidate survey, that's doing endorsements, to make sure that this is one of the main topics that candidates are asked to speak to. And stay tuned, because we are working on a petition to have every single candidate at every level of government to take a pledge that if the situation is not resolved, that if elected in 2023, they will do everything within their power to ensure that this fuel is drained out of the tanks and that Red Hill is shut down permanently. So stay tuned.
Thank you. Okay, we're at 1:30. I want to be really respectful of everyone's time. We've recorded. We're going to share publicly. We'll email you the presentation. Thank you, Wayne and Anna, Kyle and Rebecca, and Raphael for being here. Please follow Sierra Club of Hawaii, Hawaii Peace and Justice, and or Oʻahu Water Protectors. Get on the email list. And thank you all for coming. And we will continue to put out action alerts and keep you all informed.
Thanks, guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Aloha.
Thank you so much, Ray.
Aloha.
Aloha, ikabai.